I still see it the same way every time a cedar board pulled free from the living room wall, dust lifting in the air like old breath and a blackened box wedged in the cavity where insulation should have been. The latch fought us. When it finally gave, a leather book slid forward soft with mildew and years the initials faint. JH and a line scrawled in darker ink across a ledger page that felt warm from my hands. They know. Stop using the lodge. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Before any of that, before the box and the ledger and the words that turned my stomach, I lived a plain, steady life 2 hours south on I-35. I kept hours at the community college archives in San Antonio, filing grants in the morning, cataloging local newspapers in the afternoon. I knew where every reel of microfilm sat and which decades smelled more like basement than history. Tuesday evenings were for laundry and a pot of chili set low. Saturday mornings for running a cloth over my grandmother's old sideboard until the wood showed its honey again. I liked trains at night the way the sound carried across the Mission Reach when the air cooled into the 70s, and I liked how the light from my neighbor's porch fell in a neat rectangle that never crossed into my yard. It was a life of edges that stayed put. When I was 17, those edges still belonged to Hollow Creek. The hill country has a way of pretending things don't change. Limestone holds heat, then lets it go in a sigh around dusk. Deer stand where the gravel road bends, daring your headlights to blink first. In October of 1997, we were in one of those dry stretches where the river ran just low enough to show polished stones, and the cedar smell rode the air like a thin resin. My mother kept her kitchen window cracked to let that smell in. A church bulletin lay on the counter under a magnet shaped like a cow. Supper was pork chops in a cast-iron skillet. If you set your fork down, you could hear the skillet tick as it cooled. The week Thomas called the word reunion felt harmless. He had a voice that made plans sound inevitable. Friday evening, he said, "Bring jackets. We'll stoke the hearth chase off the cobwebs, remind this place who it belongs to." I wasn't invited. That part came soft careful. "When you're 19, you'll be first on the list," he said, and I pretended it didn't sting, even though my birthday sat just inside November like a taunt. My mother hung up and wiped her hands on a dish towel and said with that tone that closes a subject, "It'll be good for the older ones. You and I will have our own weekend here." The lodge had always been a kind of proof my grandfather's hands set into cedar and stone. He poured the footing himself, told every boy in town that a house needs to stand against heat more than cold, and propped the porch swing with chain thicker than his thumb. The drive up there measured long, nearly 7 miles of washboard gravel after you left the county road. From the porch you could hear wind run the length of the valley and tuck itself into the limestone bluff like a blanket. We weren't fancy people. We were the kind who counted steps between fence posts and knew the weight of a good crescent wrench. The lodge made us feel like we'd built a small quarter of the earth. Those days had their rhythm. Patricia's porch light flicked on at the same time every evening, a yellow bowl on the end of a cul-de-sac. Jacob's laughter arrived in a driveway before he did. Elena's camera strap cut a shallow red line across her collarbone from always being ready. When Lily was coming down the road, you could hear it a mile out. A trunk rattle radio up too loud the way teenagers mean to say they're alive without saying anything at all. The last time I saw them together before that weekend was a backyard cookout behind the VFW hall. Thomas corrected the propane regulator with a pair of pliers while telling me, half-joking, that law school would cure his family's habit of ignoring paperwork. Claire pressed a can of root beer into my hand and nudged me toward the shade. "You'll be there at 19, she said. "Time runs fast." Granddaddy had been gone a year by then. His boots still stood under the lodge bench like he might step into them any minute. After the funeral, we boxed up most of his things, but my mother couldn't throw away the paper maps he kept under the truck seat. The edges were worn down to velvet and marked with pencil. The river bends the fence he never got around to mending the spot where the creek bottom dropped away too quick after a storm. When I smoothed them out on our kitchen table, my fingers traced a single note he had circled years ago in a shaky hand. Keep shut. I didn't ask what he'd meant. In our family, the rule was simple. If a door is closed and nobody's screaming, you let it be. The Friday the cousins drove up the heat gave us one last grin before sliding toward fall. It read 84 to GF on the pharmacy sign near the square at 5 o'clock, then dropped quick once the sun tipped past the grain elevator. I stood at the screen door and watched my mother tie up the trash, the bag swinging while cicadas scraped the edges of their song down to a thin wire. We could hear tires on gravel a long time before we saw lights across the rise. By the time those headlamps cast a white bar across the cedar trunks, the town had gone quiet in the way small towns do after supper, televisions low, the last porch conversations trailing off a dog letting out one bark just to stay honest. I pictured the lodge breathing open windows lifted, the great stone hearth wiped with a damp rag, Jacob tuning his guitar by ear, then twisting the peg a hair back just to make it right. I slept with my bedroom window cracked an inch. Hollow Creek air carries, and if a story is being told within half a mile, you sometimes get a word or two like a gift. I didn't expect to hear anything from 7 miles out. Not real words, just the shape of the night, but around 11 there was a thin breeze that smelled like smoke, and I felt standing there, what I've felt since the particular piece of a fire tended by people you love. I breathed it in as if I could hold them right there on that porch with it. The first soft crack in the week came the next morning, and felt like nothing at the time. My mother set out mugs and cleaned the Mr. Coffee as if the cousins might come down from the lodge dusty and hungry and ask for pancakes. She liked the house to be ready for arrivals. While she flipped bacon, she told me she'd heard the church bell lag the hour last night as if the rope had slipped a notch. Then she laughed it off. We didn't talk about signs. If a light bulb burned, you got a new one. If the hinge squealed, you hit it with WD-40. We kept the world running with little fixes. I was keeping notes for myself that fall mundane things headings that would help me remember where the time went when it hid from me. October 17th, 1997. I wrote in my blue notebook, gas $1.20 gal. Mrs. Teague brought pecans. Heard coyotes at 2 a.m. far off. That's all. No mark about the smoke drifting from the northwest, though I remember watching the morning light pick out a pale flag of it, just a suggestion over the cedar line, and no mark about the way the phone didn't ring that Saturday night when it usually did. On good weekends, Claire called from the payphone by the feed store with stories that didn't need to be true to be worth telling. I let it slide, told myself the lodge phone worked fine, and they were together and warm and content to keep it that way. By Sunday morning, the air had that thin October edge that makes your breath show when you first step outside. I carried the trash down to the can at the curb and let the lid fall soft so it wouldn't bang and stir the neighbor's dog. The sky had that bright Texas blue you can't find in a crayon box, and the light put hard edges around everything. The mailbox flag, the braided rope of the porch, swing the little spider's web that had gone from misted lace to invisible in the space of my walk to the curb and back. I put coffee on and set 2 plates out anyway. Some habits only look like hope. That was the year you could still buy a Sunday paper thick enough to anchor a tablecloth outdoors. I spread ours on the kitchen table, cut coupons I knew we'd never use, and then laid out the local section like a map. I read the sheriff's blotter because I always did and because it worked like a pulse for the town, a broken tail light, a check to rubber to clear a boy who tipped a canoe and didn't want to admit he'd been on private water. Nothing there about us, nothing about the lodge, nothing about the road out that way. Sunday evening ran long and golden, the kind of light that can trick you into thinking time would stretch if you asked it nicely. I raked the front yard and filled 2 leaf bags, then sat on the porch steps and listened to the sounds roll out in order like always. A far train horn, the flag halyard ticking against metal outside Carpenter's Supply. Someone shutting the door of a pickup without slamming it. The wind spends itself doing small work like that when it's got room. I tried not to look at the clock. Around 6, I walked the length of our street and back, not for exercise, but to put my eyes on porch lights I'd known since I was small. It mattered to me that they came on in the right order. The Wilkins porch first. Then that dim bulb at Mrs. Teague's like a candle stub. Then Patricia's light at the end of her cul-de-sac, strong and steady, as if she'd wired it to a promise. When I reached our driveway again, dusk had gathered enough courage to lay its blue over the yards, and I could see my mother's shadow in the kitchen window, her hands moving without pause, wiping, stacking, resetting the next hour the way you set dominoes before you count them down. Television at 7. Wheel of Fortune, because that's what she watched to wind the day down. Plates on the coffee table, meatloaf, green beans, a square of cornbread cut clean. The food tasted right. It always did. The living room smelled like dryer sheets and whatever the neighbor's Jasmine threw over the fence after dark. I chewed slow, waiting for the sound our phone made when it had to climb from a trunk line and push through old copper, the tiny click you could feel in the bones under your ear before the ring proper started. Nothing. 8 came and went. I stacked plates in the sink. By 9, the house sounded different, not quieter exactly, just like it had pulled its shoulders up around its ears. I went to my room and set the alarm for school hours anyway, as if that small act could convince the week to start the way it should. I lay still with the window open to let the night settle me. The hill country dark is gentle when it wants to be. It hangs low but loose, and the stars don't shout. They just hold steady. Around 10, wind caught our maple and ran a hand through it from top to bottom. I heard the porch swing outside creak across one link of chain, then stop. The sound was so ordinary I didn't think about it until I did. When I rose and crossed the floorboards to look through the curtains, our swing sat perfectly still, but at the edge of the street where I could just see down the bend toward the county road, a porch on someone else's house shone a little brighter than usual, like somebody had set it to high. I told myself it was a new bulb. I told myself light was just light. 10:30 came and went. I turned the radio on low and spun the dial until I found the Amarillo station that bled in after dark. The DJ said the Cowboys had practiced in full pads and the front blowing through west of Abilene would stall before sunrise. I kept my finger on the volume knob and waited for the voice that always came at the end of a good weekend, the one that said, "Home soon," or "Tell your mom don't lock up yet." The house held its breath, and I held mine with it. I didn't know it yet, not in any way I could have put down in my blue notebook, but that was the last hour the world still felt hinged, every door on its pins, every chain on its proper link. At 11, I shut off the radio and set my glasses on the table like I always did. The far porch stayed lit, the road stayed empty. I turned my pillow over for the cool side and closed my eyes against a quiet that pressed so close I could hear it. And then, because habits are heavier than fear, I left our own porch light burning, pointed at a driveway that should have filled with headlights by now, but didn't. I remember the color of that night more than anything else, a pale gold fading into blue, the kind of light that settles when the sun's already gone, and the day hasn't decided what to do with its ghosts. I'd left the porch light burning the way my mother always did when someone was still out there on the road. But the phone never rang, and by the time the last news segment ended, my mother had gone quiet. She stood at the sink, hands still in dishwater eyes on something I couldn't see through that kitchen window. There are silences that don't feel empty. They feel loaded, like the air's holding a secret it hasn't figured out how to tell you. That was Sunday night in Hollow Creek. By Monday morning, the cousins were gone, and none of us knew it yet. The first call came from Aunt Patricia. It wasn't panic, not at first, just that strained, polite tone families use when they're trying not to sound like they're worrying. She said she hadn't heard from Thomas or Claire and asked if they might have stopped by. I told her no, they hadn't. She said the same thing about the others. Probably just stayed late, she said, though her voice faltered halfway through. You know how they get when they're together. But by evening, that sentence had worn thin. I could hear her chain-smoking through the line, each flick of the lighter punching through the static. The sheriff's office promised to send someone up there the next morning just to check. Routine welfare visit, that's what they called it. Nobody was using the word missing yet. When the deputies finally drove up to the lodge, the air had that brittle stillness after a cold front, the kind where sound doesn't travel right. I wasn't there, but I've seen their photos so many times I can almost convince myself I was. 2 cars still parked outside, keys on the dash trunks packed with weekend bags. The door locked from the inside. No footprints on the porch, no tire tracks past the gravel bend. Inside, the mugs lined up by the sink like someone had rinsed them after breakfast. But there was no breakfast, no smell of bacon or coffee. A fire still smoldered in the hearth, though the deputies said it looked freshly tended. That detail has never stopped bothering me. Someone fed it after the time they should have vanished. Someone alive. When my mother told me, I laughed a dry sound I didn't recognize. I told her there had to be a mistake. 5 of them. All gone. People don't just evaporate. She didn't answer me. She just set down the phone, leaned her elbows on the counter, and said, "Your grandfather's house never liked being empty." It was a strange thing to say, but I understood it even then. That lodge was built on stubborn ground, the kind of land that remembers everything. By midweek, the story reached the local news. 5 cousins missing in Burke County. The anchor tried to make it sound temporary, like a flat tire they'd fix by morning. Reporters stood by the gravel road pointing to cedar trees and limestone cliffs as if they meant something. My aunt's face appeared in every shot, her eyes swollen from crying, but her voice clipped, controlled. She said they were a good family. She said they'd come home. After the cameras left, she stopped saying much of anything at all. That Friday, I drove out there myself. The deputies had already roped the area off, but one of them, a man I vaguely knew from school, let me stand by the gate. The road into Hollow Creek twisted like it didn't want to be found a single ribbon of dirt cut through trees that swallowed sound. The lodge sat deep in the valley, its roof sagging under shadow. Even from a distance it felt wrong, too, still too sealed. I could smell cedar and something else underneath it. Something sour, like rain trapped in old wood. When the wind shifted, the porch swing moved just an inch enough to make its chains whisper. I remember thinking that it shouldn't be moving. There was no breeze strong enough for that. They searched for a week straight. Volunteers, dogs, drones, when those were still new. Nothing. No torn clothing, no dropped keys, not even a footprint past the porch. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. People started inventing explanations to fill the silence drugs a suicide packed some stranger from the highway. None of it fit. They were too grounded, too practical for that kind of story. What nobody said out loud, but what everyone thought, was that the land itself might have turned on them. By November, the headlines stopped. The search tapered off. The sheriff's office called it an unresolved disappearance, which was a bureaucratic way of saying they were done. Thanksgiving came and went with 5 empty chairs. That first year, Aunt Patricia didn't cook. She just set out 5 plates and left them untouched, as if pretending could pull them back. My mother stopped going to church after that. I think faith asks you to accept too many kinds of loss, and she'd already used up her share. Over time, the world rearranged itself around the hole they left. The lodge was boarded up, its windows nailed shut. The property sat in probate limbo after Granddad's estate dissolved, so nobody had the right or the heart to tear it down. Rumors turned into folklore. Kids dared each other to drive out there after dark, said they saw lights moving through the trees. People claimed to hear laughter on still nights or music drifting across the valley. Maybe they did. Places hold echoes longer than people do. For me, silence became its own habit. I finished school, took a job at the college archives, filed papers by day, and came home to a quiet house. The Holstead name faded from the local paper, except for the occasional anniversary of disappearance piece. Each year, the photo looked grainier, the smiles harder to see. I told myself forgetting was the only way to stay sane. But forgetting doesn't erase anything, it just buries it where you can't reach it until someone digs it up again. That someone turned out to be Daniel Pierce. His email arrived last spring, subject line, Inquiry, Hollow Creek Case. I almost deleted it, assuming it was another journalist looking for a quote they could twist, but the way he wrote stopped me. "We're filming a documentary series on unresolved American disappearances," he said. "I believe yours is the story that explains the others." I didn't know what he meant by that. When I asked how he'd found me, he said, "You were the youngest, the only one left who knew them before the silence. We met 3 months later on that same road where I'd once stood behind the police tape. Time had widened it, gravel replaced by crushed limestone county signage where the old mile markers used to lean. The valley hadn't changed, though. It still felt like a place where sound went to die. Daniel was taller than I expected, with a voice that made everything sound deliberate, like each word was weighed before it left his mouth. He wasn't what I'd call friendly, but there was something steady about him, the kind of calm people mistake for confidence. His crew, Ryan, the cameraman, and a young woman on audio, worked with quiet efficiency, like they'd learned not to speak more than the land allowed. When Daniel asked if I was ready, I told him no, but that it didn't matter. You can wait forever for readiness and never get closer. We started down the path together, the smell of cedar thick in the air. The lodge appeared slowly, as if testing our resolve. Up close, it looked smaller than I remembered. The porch half-collapsed shingles gone black with mildew. I expected it to feel empty, but it didn't. It felt watchful. Inside, dust hung in slow spirals where our footsteps stirred the floorboards. The air carried that mix of rust and mold you only get from water seeping through time. A beer can lay crushed near the fireplace, the label faded but still legible. I ran my fingers along the mantel and came away with a film of soot. The hearth itself looked wrong ashes gray, but too fine, like they'd been swept and relit over and over. Daniel crouched beside it, studying the burn pattern. "They said this was cold when the sheriff arrived," he murmured. "But it wasn't. Someone restarted it that morning." I stared at him, trying to process the words. "So someone stayed," I said finally. He nodded, or came back. Ryan lifted his camera and began to film. The light from the doorway stretched long across the floor, touching the old rug my grandmother had woven herself. I remember that rug from childhood, red and tan stripes running unevenly where she'd lost count on the loom. Seeing it there, half covered in dust, brought something sharp to my throat. You spend decades building distance, and then a single thread can pull you straight back. We moved through the room slowly. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and rain. Cabinets still held dishes, one with a chip shaped like a crescent moon. On the table sat Elena's old camera, the strap curled tight around itself. I picked it up without thinking, and for a moment my reflection blinked back at me from the cracked lens. The last photo that camera ever took was printed in every newspaper back then, a black frame with a streak of light at the corner. No one ever figured out what it was. A flashlight, maybe. Or something moving faster than a hand could catch. I'd always thought it was just an accident, the shutter firing as she set it down. But now, standing there, I wasn't so sure. Daniel asked if I wanted to see something they'd found in the archives. He handed me a manila folder, thick with old photographs. The prints were the same ones the sheriff's office had taken that Monday morning. Same furniture, same angles. But in one photo near the doorway, the dust showed faint shapes, almost footprints. Narrow, small. He said those prints were never in the official report. A retired deputy had kept them in his personal box until last year. When I looked closer, I realized they weren't men's boots. They looked like bare feet, I said her name before I could stop myself, Lily. Daniel didn't answer. Outside, the light had shifted again, gone from gold to that bruised gray that means evening's closing in. I stood by the porch and watched the swing move in the wind, or maybe not the wind, and felt the first real chill of what we were walking into. For so long I'd wanted answers. Now I wasn't sure I could bear them. Daniel must have seen it in my face because he said softly, "The past doesn't get smaller by ignoring it." His voice carried something heavy under the calm. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll talk to someone who remembers how the case went quiet." He didn't tell me who, but I had a feeling. In a town like Hollow Creek, secrets never die. They just trade hands until the weight breaks someone's back. As we packed up the equipment and headed down the dirt road, I glanced once more toward the valley. The last of the daylight caught the lodge windows, and for an instant they reflected the sky bright enough to blind me. When I looked again, they were dark. I don't know if it was imagination or memory, but I thought I saw a figure in that reflection, a flicker of movement behind the glass there, and gone before I could draw breath. Daniel didn't see it, or if he did, he chose not to mention it. We drove the 7 miles back to town in near silence. The road unspooled behind us, the cedar smell fading, replaced by the faint metallic scent of rain. In the side mirror, the hill dipped and disappeared, and I felt that old tightening in my chest, the one that comes when the land seems to be watching you leave. By the time we reached the diner on Main Street, the sky had turned the color of cooling ash. Daniel parked, turned off the engine, and said quietly, "You'll want to hear what she has to say. But I should warn you, it won't make sleeping any easier." He was right about that. I haven't slept easily since. And that night, as I lay in a motel bed 2 blocks from the square, the air conditioner humming low, I kept seeing those bare footprints in my mind, small, uneven, caught mid-turn, as if someone had been running not out, but back in. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that the prints were decades old, that ghosts can't leave tracks. But somewhere in the valley, under the same wind that had carried our family's laughter all those years ago, the cedar trees shifted against one another with a sound like whispering. And I knew deep down that Hollow Creek had never stopped keeping its own account of what really happened. The air outside the diner still carried that late summer warmth that sticks to your clothes long after sunset, but inside it smelled like coffee and fryer grease and the kind of conversations that never quite end. Daniel sat across from me, tapping a spoon against his cup. Not from impatience, but the kind of rhythm people fall into when they're thinking their way through something they already dread. Across from him sat a woman I didn't recognize. Her silver hair cropped short, eyes sharp, restless. He introduced her as Karen Wilkes. Her father, he said, was the sheriff who led the original search. That name hit me hard. I remembered the sheriff from the newspapers back then, remembered his face in front of the lodge the day the case was called inactive. Karen said quietly that she'd wanted to meet me for years, but hadn't known how. Her voice was low, steady, but I could tell she'd rehearsed every word she was about to say. She told us her father had carried the Hollow Creek case with him until the day he died. He'd told her something was wrong with the investigation from the start, that files disappeared, that evidence was rewritten or thrown out. Then she leaned forward and said the thing that made the booth feel too small. He thought someone powerful made sure it stayed unsolved. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. She said the sheriff's notes mentioned a notebook one of my cousins had been keeping it that weekend, and that it vanished before it could be logged as evidence. Her father, she said, believed the notebook was the reason the case was buried. Whoever wrote in it found something they shouldn't have, she whispered. The word found sat heavy between us. For years I'd told myself the disappearance was a tragedy, maybe an accident, something that took them all at once and left nothing behind. But this was different. This was a deliberate act, a secret someone had tried to erase. Karen slid a small, folded paper across the table, a photocopy of one of her father's last notes. The writing was faint water-stained. It said, Ledger Lodge Inheritance. The moment I read it, I thought of Thomas, how he'd always scribbled things in his pocket notebook, how Aunt Patricia used to roll her eyes and say, "He's turning into a lawyer before he's even passed the bar." My stomach turned cold. That night, Daniel and I drove through town in silence. The streets were mostly empty, a few porch lights glowing behind mosquito nets, the soft flicker of a television in a front window. I asked where we were headed, though I already knew. Patricia's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac on the south edge of town, a single porch light glowing like it had been waiting for years. My mother used to say Patricia had turned into a ghost that refused to leave daylight. We parked in front and sat for a long moment, neither of us moving. Daniel finally said, "If she doesn't want to talk, we walk away." I nodded, but when the door opened before we even reached the steps, I felt that plan slip away. Patricia stood there framed by yellow light, thinner than I remembered hair, gray and loose eyes, the same shade as Claire's. She didn't look surprised to see me. "You look like your mother," she said, then glanced past me at Daniel and the camera bag slung over his shoulder. "You brought them here." I said I was just trying to understand. After a pause, she stepped aside. "Then come in," she said. "But I won't perform for that thing." She meant the camera. Daniel nodded and left it by the door. Inside smelled of lavender and dust. Every surface was polished, every picture frame aligned except for one section of wall that stood empty. I realized it was where the photos of Thomas and Claire should have been. She caught me looking and said, "I don't hang ghosts." Her words were brittle but not cruel. We sat at her kitchen table, hands folded on the linoleum like we were there to pray. She didn't offer coffee, didn't ask why we'd come. I started gently. I told her about Karen's father, about the missing notebook. Her eyes flicked once, quick, then she looked down at her hands. "Thomas had it," she said. "Small leather worn at the corners. He carried it everywhere that weekend. Said it was for school notes, but he wouldn't let anyone read it." She hesitated, then added, "He said your grandfather's land wasn't what it seemed." The words sent a strange shiver through me. My grandfather, Jim Holstead, had been the definition of upright. A dentist, a mason, a man who wore his Sunday shoes even when he mowed the yard. But Patricia's face hardened. "He said your grandfather was mixed up in things that would shame the family." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What kind of things?" Patricia gave a small, tired laugh. "Deals. Money that didn't come from teeth. I don't know. He frightened Claire with it, whatever it was. She wanted to leave early that night, but she didn't." Her voice cracked just a little, like the memory still scraped against bone. I asked if she thought that notebook had anything to do with why they disappeared. She shook her head. "I think people talk too much about mysteries when the truth is simpler. Something terrible happened, and maybe it was an accident. People die every day for no reason worth naming." Daniel's voice stayed calm. "Then why hide evidence? Why bury the notebook?" Patricia's gaze sharpened. "Because land means more than lives in this county. You dig deep enough, you'll see it. But you won't like what you find." For a moment, none of us spoke. I could hear the refrigerator hum and the faint buzz of a porch light outside. Then she stood, went to a cabinet, and returned with a small tin box. She set it on the table like it weighed 100 pounds. "This is all I kept," she said. Inside were Scrap's old receipts, a Polaroid of Thomas on the lodge porch, a grocery list, and a small folded note worn at the edges. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was Thomas's neat measured. October 10th, 1997. Hollow Creek. The ledger exists. Hidden in the walls. I looked up. Patricia's eyes were glassy but unflinching. "That's all I know," she said. "And that's all I'll say. Please don't come back here." We left without another word. Outside, the air felt heavier, the kind that clings before a storm. Daniel didn't speak until we reached the car. "A ledger," he said softly, "and it's hidden in the walls." I nodded, still gripping the note. Patricia's voice echoed in my head. "Maybe it'll take you with them." That night, I barely slept. I kept seeing the lodge in my mind, those cedar planks aging in silence for 26 years, and wondered if Thomas had written that line knowing someone would come looking someday. At dawn, Daniel knocked on my motel door. He didn't ask if I'd changed my mind. The road back to Hollow Creek was slick with dew, the fields pale and silver under the early sun. The lodge looked almost gentle in that light, as if time had been kind enough to soften its edges. Daniel parked near the overgrown drive and opened the trunk. "We'll document everything he said." Ryan followed with the camera cases, quiet, careful, like a man entering church. I stood there a moment longer, hand on the torn note in my pocket, and felt a strange pull between dread and duty. Inside, the air was brighter than before, though it still smelled like damp wood and old ash. Dust floated through the beams of sunlight coming through the cracked shutters. Daniel carried a crowbar and tapped gently along the paneling, listening for changes in sound. Each knock echoed hollow, then solid, then hollow again. My heart followed the rhythm. At the far wall beneath the small window, the sound changed duller, as if something sat behind it. Daniel glanced at me. "Here." He wedged the crowbar into a seam and pulled. The board creaked, splintered, and came loose with a sigh of stale air. Behind it, the faint outline of a box sat wedged between studs. It was smaller than a shoebox wood, blackened with age, brass latch green with corrosion. Daniel put on gloves and eased it out. My breath caught as he pried it open. Inside were papers curled at the edges, brittle, water-stained. On top lay a leather book, dark and cracked initials faintly pressed into the cover, J.H., my grandfather's. The smell that rose out of that box was something I'll never forget. A mix of paper mildew and something metallic, almost like coins left in the rain. Daniel opened it carefully. The first pages were neat rows of dates, dollar amounts, and initials. As he turned the pages, the handwriting changed, sloppier, urgent. And then one line written in darker ink different from the rest. "They know. Stop using the lodge. Too many eyes. Burn the rest." For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the camera whirring quietly as Ryan zoomed in. Daniel finally whispered, "This isn't just a ledger. It's proof of transactions, money, property bribes, maybe." He flipped to the next page, showing names abbreviated and parcels of land marked by coordinates. Some were circled, others crossed out. "Your grandfather was moving money through land deals," Daniel said, "and someone wanted it erased." I traced one line with my finger, the ink faded but legible Hollow Creek stay, quiet. A sudden gust pushed through the cracked window, stirring dust into a swirl. I turned, certain I saw movement in the tree line outside, a shadow shifting too tall to be wind. Ryan followed my gaze. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Daniel closed the ledger gently and slid it back into the box. "We're done here," he said. "Let's take it back to town, get it documented before anyone else knows what we found." As we stepped outside, the air seemed heavier, the valley unnaturally still. The porch swing hung motionless, yet I could swear I heard a faint creak as if something unseen had just let go of it. We drove back in silence, the box strapped in the back seat, like fragile evidence of a truth that had waited too long. I kept one hand on the seat beside it, afraid it might disappear the moment I looked away. The road wound through the valley, each curve revealing just how alone that lodge had always been. And still, as we passed the last bend, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't left it behind completely. That somewhere in those woods, the story we'd uncovered was shifting awake again. Patient and unfinished, waiting for us to turn back. We didn't talk much on the drive back into town. Daniel kept both hands tight on the wheel, eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. the headlights sweeping long through the cedar as if they might cut open another secret. The ledger sat in its box behind us, wrapped in a towel from the motel. Every bump in the pavement made it shift with a soft thud, and each time it did, I felt my stomach tighten. I'd spent half my life wanting answers, and now that they were sitting in the back seat, I couldn't tell whether I was more afraid of what we'd found or of who might already know we had it. We pulled into the sheriff's office parking lot a little after 8. The building looked the same as it had 26 years ago. White siding, 2 flickering bulbs above the door, the smell of dust and coffee leaking out through the cracks. Sheriff Claiborne met us in the hallway. He was in his 60s, then a big man with the kind of politeness that feels practiced. I'd met him once when I was a teenager when my cousins first went missing. He'd shaken my hand and told me, "The truth always finds daylight." I remembered thinking how sure he sounded, but now, all these years later, that same man looked like daylight had cost him something. Daniel set the box down on his desk. "We found this inside the lodge," he said, "behind a wall panel." The sheriff stared at it for a long time, not moving. Then he looked up at me. "Who told you to look there?" His tone wasn't curiosity. It was concern, maybe even warning. "My aunt mentioned a notebook," I said. "Thomas wrote about a ledger. We thought it might help." The sheriff nodded slowly but didn't reach for it. "You shouldn't have gone in there," he said. "That property's under state restriction." Daniel asked. Since when? Claiborne didn't answer. He just stood up, went to the blinds, and turned one slat with his finger. "You folks stay at the motel near the highway?" Daniel said yes. The sheriff nodded again. "I'll have to file this with evidence," he said finally. "You'll get a call when it's logged." The air in that office turned heavy. I could see the clock behind him, 8:47 p.m. And I remember thinking how small that room felt, how the walls seemed closer than they should have been. Daniel said quietly, "You don't want to see what's inside." Claiborne turned his jaw set. "Some things are better left where they were found," he said, then picked up the box, tucking it under his arm. I opened my mouth, ready to argue, but Daniel's hand brushed my sleeve, a silent signal to stop. The sheriff walked down the hall, disappearing into a back room. The door clicked shut behind him. When we stepped outside, the air smelled like rain and metal. Daniel lit a cigarette and didn't speak for nearly a minute. "He's hiding something," I said. "Or protecting someone." Daniel exhaled slow. Maybe both. The sky had gone black. No stars, no moon. Just that low, heavy kind of darkness that presses down on everything. I looked at the sheriff's office, a single light still burning in his back room, and I knew the ledger wasn't staying in evidence. It would vanish like everything else tied to that lodge. The next morning, Daniel woke me early. He'd gotten a call from a woman named Carol, one of the old deputy's widows. She'd heard about the ledger through a friend and said there was something we needed to see before we left town. We drove to her house on the far side of Burke County, past the river and the rusted feed mill. Her porch was lined with wind chimes that barely moved even in the breeze. Carol looked fragile but sharp, the kind of woman who remembered everything but knew better than to share it too soon. She poured coffee into mismatched cups and set a small photo album on the table. "My husband took these," she said. The album was full of Polaroids from the original investigation angles of the lodge. I'd never seen close-ups of the hearth, the window, the porch. She pointed to one in particular. It showed a section of wall where Daniel and I had found the ledger, but the photo was dated October 1997, and in it, that section was already patched over. They sealed that wall 2 days after the search ended, she said. Told us it was for weatherproofing. But my husband, he thought it was something else. Daniel asked what happened to him. Carol looked down. He died in a car crash 3 months later. They said he fell asleep at the wheel. He hadn't slept in days, that much was true. But he was scared of something. He kept saying there were names in that book no one wanted seen. I asked her if she remembered any. She shook her head, then hesitated. He mentioned a man, she said softly. Name of Randall, or maybe Ronald. Something like that. Always said he was the one who handled the dirty end of the deals. He was one of your grandfather's men, worked the land leases. Moved up north after the disappearances. She slid another photo from the back of the album. A group shot 5 men standing beside a pickup. The second from the left caught my eye. His face was shadowed by a hat, but there was something about the stance, the bulk of the shoulders. That him, I asked. Carol nodded. Randall Clark, she said. Last I heard, he's still around. Got a place near Hollow Creek Ridge. By noon, Daniel had tracked down an address. We drove out along a dirt road that turned to ruts after a few miles. The hills rose sharp and narrow cedar on one side, limestone on the other. Clark's house sat half collapsed at the edge of an old ranch, a tangle of barbed wire and rusted farm equipment scattered across the yard. A single barn leaned against the wind like it was tired of standing. Daniel cut the engine. You sure you want to go in there? He asked. I told him I'd come this far. I wasn't turning back now. The man who opened the door looked older than I expected, but not weak. His hair was white, his face tanned deep from years of work. He didn't seem surprised to see us. You Holsteads never could leave well enough alone, he said. His voice was low, sandpaper rough. I said we weren't looking for trouble, just answers. Answers, he repeated, almost laughing. That's what they all want until they get them. He looked past me at Daniel, then stepped aside. Come in then. Let's see if you can handle it. Inside smelled of old hay and oil. A wood stove burned in the corner, though the day was warm. He sat down at a small table and poured himself coffee from a thermos, no offer to share. You found the book, he said. Sheriff called me last night. I felt my pulse spike. So you know what was in it? He gave a dry smile. Enough to stay alive. He leaned back in his chair, watching us the way a man watches weather. He can't change. Your granddaddy did what men like him always did, made deals. Land uranium leases, sometimes people. The money came easy. But easy money draws bad company. When he tried to back out, they sent me. His eyes settled on me, steady, almost pitying. He wanted to shut it down. I told him the only way to do that was to burn the evidence. He didn't, so they came for him first. My throat went dry. What about my cousins? I asked. He looked down at his hands, the knuckles mottled and scarred. They found something up there. The old man's ledger, maybe. I don't know how, but they shouldn't have. I was supposed to scare them off, not... His voice cracked for the first time. Things got out of hand. One of the boys fought back. The girl tried to run. The others... He stopped staring into his cup. I buried them under the roots where the creek bends. That oak's been gone a long time now. Daniel's jaw tightened. You're saying you killed them? Clark shook his head. I didn't kill all of them. He rubbed his temple. One lived. A girl. She was hurt bad, but she lived. My breath caught. Who? He looked up, eyes glassy but unflinching. Claire, he said. They told me to finish it, but I couldn't. I brought her here. Kept her out of sight. For a while. The words landed like a stone in my chest. You're lying, I said. But even I didn't sound convinced. You think I wanted to? He snapped. You think I wanted to spend 20 years with a ghost in my barn? Daniel stood up, motioned for me to step back. Where is she now? He asked. Clark didn't answer. He just stared out the window toward the barn. You shouldn't have come here, he said quietly. Then, almost to himself. She doesn't like visitors. We followed his gaze. The barn doors were half open, the interior swallowed by dark. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. Daniel started toward it, but Clark grabbed his arm. Don't, he said, voice low. You'll regret it. Daniel shook him off and walked on anyway, camera light cutting through dust and cobwebs. I followed, heart hammering. The air inside was thick, the smell of rot and hay, and something else, something sour. Daniel's light swept across the stalls, and that's when I saw her. She stood in the far corner, barefoot, hair matted, eyes wide and unblinking. For a moment, I couldn't move. My brain refused to name what my eyes saw. She looked older than her years should have made her skin pale thin as paper, but there was no mistaking her face. Claire. My cousin. Alive. She flinched from the light, made a small sound like a gasp. Daniel froze. We're not here to hurt you, he said gently. She didn't answer, just pressed herself back against the boards. Chains rattled near her feet, thin, rusted, looped around one ankle. My stomach turned. I took a step forward and she whispered something I couldn't make out. It sounded like, "He's coming." Behind us, the barn door groaned. Clark stood in the doorway, shotgun in hand, his face shadowed. "I told you not to," he said. Daniel's hand went up slowly. "It's over, Randall," he said. "She needs help." The old man's voice was steady. "Help? You think anyone in this county would help her now?" He raised the gun slightly, and the motion broke something in me. I stepped between them, shaking. "She's family," I said. "If you ever cared about any of them, you'll put that down." His eyes flickered, and for the briefest second I thought he might. Then the world exploded into noise, the crack of a shotwood splintering, the sound of Claire screaming. I don't remember hitting the ground, only the smell of dust and gunpowder. Daniel's voice shouting the sound of another shot that didn't come from the same gun. Sirens in the distance. When I opened my eyes again, the barn was half full of smoke and Randall Clark was gone. By the time the deputies arrived, the only things left were the smell of burned hay and the sound of Claire's breathing beside me, shallow, uneven, but alive. They took her away, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes unfocused, whispering words only she could hear. As they loaded her into the ambulance, she turned her head slightly, her lips forming one phrase I'll never forget. He said, "He always comes back." The night closed around us, heavy and silent. The barn door swung open and shut in the wind, the hinges groaning like an old voice repeating a warning too late to matter. Daniel stood beside me, face pale in the flashing red lights. Neither of us spoke. We both knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The smell of smoke clung to my jacket for days after that night, even after the fire trucks had left and the deputies had closed off the road. The barn was just a shell by morning charred boards, smoldering hay, the faint shimmer of heat rising off the metal roof. Claire was taken to the hospital in Austin. Daniel stayed with her while I gave my statement to the sheriff's deputies, but by the time I was done, Sheriff Claiborne was gone. He'd left before sunrise, no explanation. The deputies said he was on leave. I didn't believe that. For the first time in decades, the silence that had hung over Hollow Creek began to crack. News of the discovery spread faster than the county could control it. 5 cousins missing since 1997, one found alive after 26 years. People drove in from nearby towns just to see the barn. Some prayed by the fence. Others took photos until the sheriff's office taped the area off. By the second day, federal agents had arrived, combing through the rubble, digging shallow trenches around the property. They found what the old man had said they would: bones under the soil near the creek bend, tangled in roots that had long outgrown them. The forensics team confirmed what we already knew in our bones. Thomas Jacob Elena and Lily were finally found. Randall Clark never made it to jail. They tracked his truck, abandoned near the ridge door, still open, engine cold. A week later, hikers found his body deep in the woods, a single gunshot wound under his jaw. The rifle was still in his hand. No note, no explanation. Maybe guilt, maybe fear, maybe he just didn't want to face the world he'd helped destroy. The sheriff resigned soon after. A joint investigation by the state and the FBI found that case files had been falsified, evidence destroyed and patrol logs rewritten during the original search. Whether Claiborne had done it out of loyalty or out of threat, no one ever proved. He moved to another county before charges could be filed. Claire stayed in the hospital for nearly 2 months. I visited her every week. At first, she didn't speak much. Her eyes followed every sound like she was still in the barn, still listening for footsteps. The doctors said her body would recover faster than her mind. They weren't wrong. Some days she was lucid, she'd talk about the others, about the fire that night at the lodge, about how Thomas had found the ledger and said it would change everything. Other days, she would look at the window and whisper like she was afraid someone might be standing outside. Once she said quietly, "He came back every fall. I knew the sound of his boots. I didn't ask what he wanted from her in all those years. Some things you learn to leave unspoken." Daniel filmed his last interview with me in her hospital room. She was asleep in the background sunlight on her face, the kind that softens even the hardest edges. He asked if I thought the truth had been worth finding. I didn't answer right away. I just watched her breathe, the rise and fall of her chest, the faint movement of her fingers under the blanket. "It's not about worth," I said finally. "It's about weight. Some truths don't set you free, they just let you stop pretending." When the documentary aired the next spring, it brought more noise than I was ready for. Reporters called old classmates I hadn't heard from in 30 years, reached out to say they always had a bad feeling about that place. But after the attention faded, Hollow Creek went quiet again. The lodge was finally condemned, torn down to its foundation. The land was transferred to the state. They say it'll become part of a conservation area, though I doubt anyone will camp there. The soil feels too heavy with memory. Claire moved to a small rehab facility near Wimberley. She learned to walk again, slow but steady. We'd sit outside under the oak trees, the kind that creak when the wind shifts, and I'd read aloud from the journals she kept after leaving the hospital. Her handwriting changed over time from jagged lines to something smoother, almost calm. The last page I ever saw her write said, "The world kept turning even when I didn't." I keep that page folded in my wallet now. Daniel went back to New York. The film won an award I can't remember the name of, but he never made another one after that. He said he told all he needed to tell. Sometimes he still calls around the anniversary just to ask if I've gone back. I haven't. I drive through Burke County sometimes, though windows down, radio low, the kind of drive where the road hum fills the space where words should be. The cedar still smells the same. But when I pass the old turnoff, the air feels different, like the ground itself remembers. People ask me if I believe justice was done. I don't know how to answer that. The men responsible are gone. The records are sealed. The families finally have graves to visit. But justice feels too clean a word for what happened. What we got was truth, messy, painful, but real. Maybe that's the closest thing there is. The hardest part to explain is how the past doesn't stay buried even when you think it has. Some nights when the air gets dry and the house goes still, I can almost hear the echo of that swing creaking in the wind, the one on my grandfather's porch. I imagine the 5 of them there again. Thomas with his notebook, Claire smiling before the weight of it all, Jacob strumming the same 3 chords he never finished learning. It's not haunting, not really. It's just memory doing what it does, reminding you that the people who disappear aren't really gone. They just move into the spaces where your silence lives. I still visit Aunt Patricia sometimes. She doesn't talk much anymore. When she does, it's about ordinary things, the weather, the price of gas, the color of the sunset over the ridge. But once as I was leaving, she stopped me on the porch and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How the land keeps all our secrets." I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't. I just know that in Hollow Creek the soil holds stories longer than people do. Every October I light a candle for the 5 of them. Not in church, not in public, just at home on my kitchen counter, the same place my mother used to stand waiting for the phone that never rang. The flame burns for a while, flickers once, then steadies. It's a small thing, but it's something. I guess that's what remembering really is, a promise to keep the light on even when nobody's coming home. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views or numbers, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.